Republicans had this deep bench. They had senators, they had governors, they had individuals with experience, and after 2 terms of a Democrat, this natural swing in politics in the United States would be to go to a Republican. And when you had the candidate of Hillary Clinton with the baggage and the trustworthy issues, then just about anyone that the Republicans put forward would have won. So it is absolutely astonishing that we are where we are today. And I would look at the deep bench as part of the problem, that with 17 candidates for the Republican primary, there were too many. And when someone asked about polling and name recognition, the one name that everyone knew was Trump. So that pumped him up in the polls, which had more media focus on him. The other is, news in America now, unfortunately, is predominantly entertainment. And when it's about entertainment and about ratings, the one thing that you want is someone that's going to bring them in, and that's what Trump does. So we need to reflect on, what do we do with American media today when it's all about polling and your ratings? Let's be clear that Trump is not a conservative and he's not a Republican. He captured the Republican channel by having so many contenders that he rose to the top. The question now for Republicans is focusing on winning the House. So I think we can expect, depending on what happens, I think we can expect a Hillary Clinton as president. So the focus for Republicans now should be ensure that we have a Republican House. And hopefully, Donald Trump loses in every single state across America so that the rest of the world realizes that America has not gone crazy. And this will also have a hollowed out Republican Party that's going to hopefully rise from the ashes into something quite positive and strong and constructive, because, as we've heard at this conference today, we need American leadership.
So if Donald Trump is the only person who can lose to Hillary Clinton, this does look like a Bill Clinton plot. Andrew.
I just wanted to send a couple of words of encouragement. First of all, we have in the UK a wonderful program called Come Dancing, in which both of them will be splendid contenders. Secondly, this won't be the first time the United States ends up with a government which is effectively paralyzed. And if we can think of no particularly good result, then at least not having a government is not such a bad thing. Belgium is famous for not having governments, and it's not such a bad country. I believe that the United States will quite rapidly recover and will set its own agenda, and in fact that lies in the hands of the people, which is why the congressional and senatorial elections are good. Don't let's despair.
Thank you. What was the Georgian word for hangover cure again? Hachari something? Thank you. That's what we need. Dato Sikoralidze, former defense minister of Georgia, former Georgian ambassador to the United States.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you a question to Kurt and David. So there is not much difference for me between Trump and Bernie Sanders, even though it enrages my liberal friends back in the United States, but I don't see any difference, big difference between two of them. And then the fact that the Bernie Sanders came second in a primary race, that really worrisome signal for me. So my question is about particularly the foreign and security policy mainstream. We've seen it before. So the Cato Institute on the right side, and then some universities that are pushing different ideas from Global Zero to the reset policy and all this kind of ideas. I mean, I think that they were more or less, in my understanding, more or less marginal. But nowadays, I mean, it seems that they are getting more mainstream. They are getting more, I mean, the mainstream, those isolationist trends in our foreign and security policy. So I would be interested in your assessment. Is it end of internationalism or the U.S. engagement as a mainstream in a foreign security policy thinking, or it's just, I don't know, crisis?
David, do you want to answer that? Or what's your take on isolationism? Is it now the norm?
I think the word I would use, Dato, is more disengagement. And I would say that began in the Obama administration, and it was in part a reaction to the Bush administration. And it shows that what one administration does have an impact on the next administration. I remembered vividly the quote that Barack Obama gave 5 days before he became president in January 2009 to the Washington Post, when he said, "You cannot promote democracy through the barrel of a gun." And for him, the invasion of Iraq was a defining moment. And he came to office promising to end 2 wars and to focus on nation building at home. And so I would define his approach more as disengagement rather than isolationism, but it has then fed into an isolationist sentiment in both parties, but arguably more in the Republican Party, which Trump has tapped into. I think it's a dangerous trend. I hope it won't continue, but it will require leadership from the highest level, meaning the president, and then with support from the Congress to re-engage and to show U.S. leadership working closely with our democratic partners all over the world. We can't do it alone, but the claim that we can't be the world's policeman, I don't know any serious Republican or Democratic foreign policy expert or specialist who wants the U.S. to be the world's policeman. But we have to show leadership on pushing back against the authoritarian challenge, on dealing with non-state actor threats, dealing with issues like terrorism, non-proliferation, but also standing for our values and our principles. After all, both the EU and the US, that's why Georgia, Ukraine, other countries want to join our community, because we say we stand by our values. But that requires leadership, it requires engagement, and it requires an understanding that what does happen in a country like this matters, and bringing that country into the Europe-Atlantic fold is critically important.
I had a thought on that. The 2 cornerstones of isolationism are, it's not our problem and we can't do anything about it. And that's when you have a president of the United States who communicates that to the public will believe it. It's not our problem, doesn't matter, we can't fix it. When you have a president of the United States who communicates the opposite, this matters, and we can do something about it, and here's what. The public, I think, is still open to that. I think there isn't a determinative isolationist view in the U.S. public. I think it's a view that can be persuaded, but it takes leadership to persuade. We don't have that leadership to persuade now. I don't believe in either case, Trump or Clinton, we will have it either. But that doesn't mean over time the U.S. just remains isolationist. I think the country is still prepared to lead if we have a leader who's willing to lead and to give the answers to those questions. Yes, it matters, and here's what we can do. The Ambassador of Turkey.
Thank you so much for your introductory remarks. David, for example, you said that, both candidates are very unpopular, and I think both parties are not very happy to end up with their candidacies. And Kurt, you said, for example, Mr. Trump, trumping continuously the values that which we thought are at the core of the American society, but still rising in popularity. My question, very simple, very naive, maybe, but how did we come to that position, really? Because for a while, we were engaged, Turkey and United States, in a program called Democracy Assistance Dialogue as part of the Greater Middle East thing. And I used to go out and talk to the Middle Eastern countries, and I used to tell them that, democracy is not only about elections. Elections can produce the wrong guys just by itself, but you need to have institutions like freedom of press, freedom of media, freedom of expression, education of democratic values from early ages, and blah, blah, blah. And all the good examples that we have given at that time was always from the United States of America. But given that, how did we come to that position with 2 unpopular candidates, with values being trumped as such? Is it only media, or is there something else as a systemic way of working of politics. And this is not only United States, because we also see that in Europe as well. Those values, which we thought are at the core of our being are, constantly and increasingly, questioned. So is there anything that we have to be careful and do something differently?
David, what did you do? I feel like a piñata today, where people are just whacking me. On the Republican side, I think there was a view among the 16 other candidates that Trump was going to self-destruct. And so they focused on each other rather than focusing on him because they felt he would take care of himself. And as a result, he got away with things that if any other candidate said them, he or she would have been drummed out of the race from the beginning. Colleen's point about the media, this is an old number, but the estimate, I think, at the beginning of this year was that Trump got something like $2 billion worth of free media. Again, that's a dated statistic. I don't know what the latest is. It's not to blame the media for the Trump phenomenon, but the other candidates were so busy going after each other that they woke up one day and discovered that the last one standing was Donald Trump. He created this image that he was speaking truth to power, that everything in Washington was corrupt, and yet he played politics as well, if not better than most people, contributing to both parties, including to Hillary Clinton. I can't really explain it because a year ago, if you had asked me, would Donald Trump be the Republican nominee, I would have laughed at you. I was going around the Baltic states. I went to Estonia last fall, and I said, if Donald Trump is the nominee or becomes the president, I'm going to seek asylum in Estonia. So I've asked Yuri Luik to give me the application form. On the Democratic side, Kurt, why don't you answer that one?
I think the Democratic side is it's a product of its own momentum, that we have developed a leading political class on the Democratic side. The Clinton era has a long, long hangover, and by the time Hillary Clinton ran again this time, they felt almost as though there was no alternative, and that was certainly her design as running for president, to make it appear that there was no alternative. The fact that that was the case did create a rebellion inside the Democratic electorate, but not strong enough and effective enough to displace her. And that's how we ended up with Sanders, the most unlikely of Democratic candidates, doing as well as he did, because he was willing to buck the trend, and that was the only place to go. But in the end, that didn't succeed either, and we have the Clinton machine now rolling into the general election.
I just have one quick point on the Republican. For the Republican establishment that was not running for president, which was only two people essentially, everyone was running for president, they also made a mistake in not understanding the threat that the Trump phenomenon represented. And so in waiting too long to take on Trump, it became almost an impossible situation for them to do so. I think had Republican leaders in the House, the Senate, taken a more forceful position early on, it might have made a difference.
There's one more point to this too, and this is my own little hobby horse, but elites in our country, and I would say this is true of elites in Berlin, in London, in Brussels, in Paris, all over, have failed to deal specifically and concretely with the anxieties and fears of publics. They have legitimate complaints, legitimate concerns about jobs, about culture, about identity, and elites who they have been benefiting from globalization and benefiting from change, have left behind the publics, and so the publics are turning to more radical solutions to clean house. And that, I think, is unfortunate, but I do think there is a great degree of blame to be cast on our own leadership. Let me turn it to Jim Nixie, who is an expert in analyzing demagogues and tyrants.
And Kurt, Jamie also wanted to.
Right. Yeah, I'd like to strike an optimistic note as well, David. Because the primary concern of almost everybody in this room, of almost everybody in this country, is Russia. Now, if Colleen is right and Hillary wins, surely we are actually lucky enough, don't wish to sound like a Hillary fan club, but surely we are lucky enough to have a president who finally understands Russia for what it is, the threat that it poses. Other than somebody who has no principles whatsoever, as far as I can tell, like Donald Trump, or somebody who thinks that Russia isn't worth dealing with, like Barack Obama, for all his other admirable qualities, Hillary Clinton has tried a reset and failed. They have fooled her. There are surely no longer any flies on her. She will not be fooled again. I posit this as a question, not a statement. And therefore, perhaps we're actually heading into a kind of perverse golden age in Russian-Western relations, where finally we will have a robust Russia policy, and I can't remember when we last had one.
So we have Putin to thank, because we have no one else to thank. Let me turn it to Batu. I'm sorry, Batu, before we get to you, we have the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung representative, Mr. Frick, in the back there. You first.
I just wanted to give a little addition to my own experience. I was fortunate enough to have lived in the United States and Germany for quite a long time. And out of a perspective from a younger person who has experienced the past years and who's been trying to find a job and trying to get ahead, I do not find the US election right now very surprising. I've lived in Missouri, I've lived in Ohio, and spent enough time in DC to see that people are very much fed up with some of the political issues the United States has, and so are people in Europe. I mean, Euroscepticism and the US election cannot be divided. We have, since 2008, had a deep financial and systemic crisis in Europe and the United States. There are a lot of young people who come out of university who don't know where they're going to find the next job. And in 2008, I saw Barack Obama when he spoke in front of the Victory Column in Berlin, and it felt like the Messiah has just descended down to earth. And of course, it was a completely overblown attitude and feeling by most Germans climbing up the lampposts. I even skipped university class and went to see him, but I knew something was not quite right there. And for my personal impression, I think what we are really lacking is a good sense of leadership, some proper statecraft, and some moral foundations. And especially as a young person who is interested in politics and who's trying to get engaged in politics, that is a big issue I see in the older generation that tries to talk about issues that we have. But if you have 40–50% youth unemployment in Southern Europe, if you have similar issues in some US states, I'm not surprised that especially young people jump on a wagon like Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump, because not all people who support Trump are old, retired army veterans. That would be a wrong perception as well. So we really have to look at what are the reasons why we are where we are. And I do believe we really have to have some tutoring classes in statecraft and in some economic stimulation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to ask Batu Kutelia, former ambassador to the United States, a McCain Institute Next Generation leader. He can still qualify as Next Generation.
Thank you. I would like to follow up on the question Turkish ambassador asked, that why US ended up where it is the political discourse now, and why the separation is not the classical left-right, but now it's turned to the totally different. But okay, that's more or less the explanation you gave is gives some basic, let's say, answers to that question. But my question is now in a more, let's say, predictive in terms of the process. So whoever becomes the president, it's clear that there is a polarization in US political spectrum. But what are the mechanisms or institutions or, I don't know, individual players that can, one way or another, try to keep US policy, particularly foreign policy, intact and up to the commitment and values or the leadership role that the US has? Is there, let's say, there have been several times joint letters of the foreign policy or security establishment to the candidates. Sometimes was a harsh attack on the candidates, whether they would get a security briefing or not. But presumably it happens. Is there any mechanisms or leverages to keep the processes more or less intact, or then we have to just run away?
Well, I have an answer, but I'm very interested to hear David's answer, who is a signatory of some of these letters of national security experts on policy. But my answer is that what the foreign policy community and what you and I would want to see depends upon the politicians having support from the publics and from the country. So if it's the elites in Washington, even though they may be right on foreign policy, that's not important. What's more important is that the political leaders have backing from the publics in order to be able to implement right policies. And that, I think, is what's lacking, and I don't see a mechanism in place right now for people to create that. I think that's a challenge for those of us who are living and working in the United States to figure out how do we connect to the rest of the country in ways that renews a demand and a support for U.S. leadership. David?
Batu, I've signed two different kinds of letters. One is Republicans in foreign policy critical of Trump, but I've also been an organizer of another letter which is bipartisan on stressing the importance of democracy and human rights, on values, rule of law, and that was for both campaigns. Actually, it was done when we had a number of candidates still in the race on the Republican side. And I do hope that before the election and after the election, there will be foreign policy experts on both sides of the aisle that will come together and stress the importance of U.S. leadership, of values, and of re-engagement in the world. And I hope that will be encouraged by foreign leaders and foreign civil societies. For Georgians to stress the importance of U.S. leadership in this region and globally, for Moldovans, for Ukrainians, in Africa, Asia, you name it. I think for the next president and the next Congress to hear from people outside the U.S. of the importance of U.S. leadership is going to be critically important.
I just want to inject a little bit of apocalypticism into this conversation, as I don't think that we've...
Right. Let's get really depressed and go drink.
If I had told anyone in this room a year ago that Hillary Clinton would be the next president, you all would have, some of you might not have been happy with that, but it hardly would have shocked anyone in this room, even the hardened Republicans like Randy over here. If I had told you that Donald Trump would be president, some of you would have laughed at me, suggested I go to an insane asylum. No one would have thought it possible. And I think over the past year, he has been normalized to a really dangerous extent. This is a candidate, I don't think there's been a more racially divisive candidate since George Wallace of 1968, and there hasn't been a candidate more in line with Russian foreign policy views than Henry Wallace of 1948. So sort of two Wallaces. We haven't even gotten, by the way, into the dubious and frightening Russian connections that Trump has. I think Jeb Bush, when he called him the chaos candidate several months ago during one of the debates, I thought that was a very apt description of Trump. I'm not suggesting that Trump is an agent of the Kremlin, that there's any sort of coordination with the Russian security services in his campaign. I just think that they see in Trump someone who doesn't believe in American leadership, who constantly attacks America's allies and alliances and says that they're wastes of time, who attacks NATO, and they basically see a guy who, if he was president of the United States, would basically accomplish many of Russia's own foreign policy goals without the Russians having to do anything. And so they are very actively trying to support his campaign through the unprecedented hacking of one of our political parties. That's never happened before. They're basically doing in America what they've done for years in your countries, in Estonia and Ukraine. You're used to this stuff, this sort of active Russian meddling in your domestic politics. This doesn't happen in the United States. Again, since the third party candidacy of Henry Wallace in 1948. So I think, and I say this as someone who's right of center and usually would vote for a Republican candidate, Hillary Clinton not only needs to win, she needs to win by such a massive, massive landslide that it gets into the heads of the Republican base that they can't do this crap again. You can't support a guy like Donald Trump and expect to win. And if this election is in any way close, then we're going to be stuck with this sort of Trumpism for a very long time.
I'm Katerina Rybika. I work for the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, and I'm also a Stanford Fellow. So I would like to allow myself a personal assessment of these elections. They're truly remarkable because a woman stands a true chance in the United States to become a president of this country. This is indeed an achievement for the entire world and also a role model for other countries. And even in Europe, you know, not many countries in Europe can say that they've passed through the Beijing target or meeting the Council of Europe targets of women representation in legislative bodies or political processes. Although these elections at the same time is a big warning, and I think James mentioned this phrase, and they're indeed a warning, because 2017 French elections are happening. What are we going to discuss when the French campaign will start? Are we going to discuss the populism? Yes, we will. And this is indeed shows that no country in the world is immune to populism. And this is very unfortunate, but this is true. And here I think that the US elections allowing us the opportunity to assess and to see whether the world and the democratic community is prepared to address this challenge. And finally, I want to say that as a Ukrainian, I look at these elections and I think it will reflect on Batu's point from the foreign policy point of view. What will be, regardless of who will become the president of the United States, country like Ukraine is most interested in the foreign policy of the new president towards Ukraine, towards Georgia, towards other countries in these regions, especially those countries that are in the post-conflict or current ongoing conflict situations like Ukraine is. And this is the key question. And I think that all of the intellectuals that are the very rich intellectual community that is present in this room now is a challenge and the question to all of us. What we can do to minimize the risk and to ensure that, you know, that the achievements of the international community that's already been done, you know, are not lost overnight with during the election night in the United States. So it's all very important, and these are the questions that probably are now without answers.
Points. I have worked in 3 presidential campaigns. They all lost. Dole 96.
All right, never mind.
McCain 2000 and McCain 2008. An anecdote about Sanders that you might find interesting. My son called me last December and he said, he's not very politically active. He's more of a ski bum type, going to school in Montana State University in Bozeman, Montana. And he said, Dad, what's the deal with this Sanders guy? And I said, well, the best way to describe him is, as a Republican senator did, is he honeymooned in the Soviet Union and never came back. And, you know, told him a little bit more about Sanders. And he said, well, everybody I know is going to vote for him. And I said, why? And he said, free tuition and legalized marijuana. So I think there is something to his appeal to young people that most of us don't think in those framework. Second, on Trump and isolationism in the Republican Party, the positions that Trump has taken, with the exception of opposing free trade, are not the positions that are motivating his voters in terms of isolationism. I mean, the fact that he's attacked NATO is obsolete, that he's questioned the alliances with Japan and South Korea, that's not what won him votes in the primaries. And I don't think that's what will win him votes in the general. So I think there's some real possibilities there. And third, on the prospect of a President Clinton, depending on what she does on her appointments, she's going to have a tremendous opportunity for bipartisan cooperation on foreign policy. Not on trade, she's dug her hole too deep, on TPP in particular, but on other issues. She talks very comfortably about American exceptionalism, which is something that Republican foreign policy leaders like to hear after a current president that doesn't apparently believe in American exceptionalism. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity if she is elected. She'll have to pursue certain partisan things on her domestic agenda, but I think she will have a real opportunity for bipartisanship on foreign policy.
Would it be characteristic or uncharacteristic of her to name people like that and choose to work in a bipartisan way?
I think it'd be characteristic. She was able to work very effectively, quietly, in a bipartisan way as a senator. She traveled with people like John McCain. They famously had vodka shots in Tallinn once upon a time early in her Senate career. So I think it would be characteristic. And if you look at where she differed with President Obama while she was Secretary of State on some key issues like arming the Free Syrian Army when it may have mattered, defensive arms to Ukraine,
responding to the red line of Syrian chemical weapons. She was in a place that most Republicans would be comfortable with, and unfortunately was unable to sway the president.
Great. Final thoughts, David?
Just picking up on this, and James, your point about her approach toward Russia. I hope you're right, but a caution I would offer is that in the past two transitions of power, George Bush came in after pretty harsh Republican criticism of Bill Clinton's policy toward Russia, an over-personalized policy, an emphasis on shock therapy, not enough on democracy, human rights. There was a congressional report that was issued that was incredibly harsh toward Clinton policy. And then George Bush came in and had his meeting in Ljubljana and looked into Putin's eyes. Barack Obama came in, 5 months after Russia invaded this country with the reset policy. She has had personal direct experience on Russia policy, unlike Bush, unlike Obama. But for some reason, when elected, at least the past two American presidents have thought, I know how to get to Putin, I know how to work with this guy. That's certainly Trump's approach going in. Clinton offered the prospect of a different approach, but we should be a little careful assuming that that is going to be what happens.
Right. There's a tendency among leaders to erroneously think that we need Russia.
Right.
We can actually do things without Russia too.
Right.
I want to thank everybody for taking part in this. I want to give a logistical note that buses will be departing at 6:30. For those who are going to the Presidential Palace for the reception, there will be departures from the lobby area at 6:30 to get over there. And a final thought on the topic of this discussion that we had. Personally, I really do believe that American democracy, American institutions are strong, they're resilient. I think the American public is smart. I don't buy into this argument that they're nativist bubbas that just don't care about it. I think the American public is actually smart and they know their interests. The reason they're lashing out is because they don't see politicians looking out for their interests. And I can very well imagine the next wave coming in of politicians who are going to be quite interested in reaching those people and giving solutions. And so I have a great deal of faith in the resilience of our democracy, even as we go through what's going to be a very deep trough for the short term. Thank you all very, very much.